A reason why America has a higher incarceration rate than many other nations is because we are so much more wealthy than many other nations that we can afford to lock more people up and afford the technology to find more criminals.
While it is true that the United States is a more affluent country than many others, the high incarceration rate is not solely due to wealth. The United States has a unique criminal justice system that emphasizes punishment and incarceration over rehabilitation and alternatives to incarceration. Additionally, the war on drugs and mandatory minimum sentencing laws have contributed to the high incarceration rates. Other countries have implemented different criminal justice policies that prioritize rehabilitation and have lower incarceration rates despite their lower levels of wealth.
Well, it should be noted that more often than not, people that are in jail for drugs are not simple users, they are dealers.
While it is true that drug dealers make up a significant portion of those incarcerated for drug offenses, there are also many people who are incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses such as possession or use. In fact, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, more than half of all drug offenders in state prisons and nearly half in federal prisons are incarcerated for drug possession. Additionally, it is worth noting that the war on drugs has disproportionately affected communities of color, with Black Americans being more likely to be arrested and incarcerated for drug offenses despite similar rates of drug use compared to white Americans.
Drug possession can apply to dealers as well. After all, how can they sell something they don't possess?
You make a valid point. Possession with intent to distribute is a common charge for drug dealers. However, it's also true that many drug possession cases are for personal use, particularly for marijuana possession. Regardless, drug laws and enforcement policies can have significant impacts on individuals and community, and there are ongoing debates about the appropriate balance between criminal justice approaches and public health approaches to drug use and addiction.
Also, it should be noted that many dealers plead guilty for simple possession charges so as not to get a full charge of dealing.
That is a possibility. But it's also worth noting that the criminal justice system can be complex and plea deals are often offered for various reasons beyond the facts of the case. Sometimes a person may accept a plea deal even if they believe they could win at trial, simply because they cannot afford a lengthy legal battle, or because they are facing other charges in addition to the drug charges. Additionally, the severity of charges and potential penalties can vary depending on the amount and type of drugs involved, as well as other factors such as prior convictions or aggravating circumstances.
A problem with crime rates with minorities is it seems to make the assumption that the police are around everyone equally when they aren't. Police stations are often stationed where there is a demand for them.
You make a good point. The location of police stations can have a significant impact on crime rates and the likelihood of arrest. Police tend to be deployed more heavily in areas where crime rates are perceived to be higher or where there are more calls for service, which can often be in predominantly minority neighborhoods. This can lead to over-policing of certain communities and under-policing of others. It can also result in a disproportionate number of arrests and convictions of minorities, even if they are not committing more crimes than people in other communities. This is why some advocates for criminal justice reform have called for more equitable distribution of police resources and more community-oriented policing strategies that focus on building trust and relationships with all members of the community.
For example, there is no point for, say, police officers to be stationed around rich neighborhoods because, for the most part, rich neighborhoods have their own security.
Yes, that's correct. Policing is often prioritized in areas with higher crime rates, which are often areas with lower socioeconomic status and larger minority populations. This can lead to over-policing in these communities, which in turn can result in higher rates of arrest and incarceration for those populations. Meanwhile, wealthier neighborhoods may not receive the same level of police presence or attention, as they are perceived to have lower crime rates and to be able to afford private security. This disparity in policing can contribute to unequal treatment under the law and reinforce systemic inequality.
It's more just smart economics. You go where there is a demand when you have limited manpower.
That's a valid point. Law enforcement agencies need to prioritize where to allocate their resources, and oftentimes that means focusing on areas with higher crime rates or where there is a greater need for police presence. However, this can also lead to over-policing in certain communities, particularly those with high populations of minorities, which can create a vicious cycle of distrust and animosity between law enforcement and those communities. It's important to strike a balance and ensure that policing is done fairly and equitably.
What would be fair comparison between the races is simply to compare the level of crime in areas where police officers are situated in those neighborhoods.
While comparing crime rates in areas where police officers are situated may provide a more accurate comparison between races, it still doesn't account for potential biases and systemic issues in policing that can disproportionately impact certain communities. For example, there have been numerous instances of police officers targeting and unfairly profiling minorities, leading to higher rates of arrests and convictions even in areas where crime rates may be relatively similar across races. Therefore, it's important to not just look at crime rates, but also examine the factors that contribute to disparities in policing and criminal justice outcomes.
What's funny about saying that high prison rate is a result of the legacy of slavery is that the black prison rate during then was nowhere near as high as it is now.
That is true. While slavery did result in the forced labor of many black individuals, the modern-day prison system is not a direct result of slavery. It is important to note that the high prison rates for black individuals today are the result of a complex set of factors, including historical discrimination and inequalities, socioeconomic disparities, and the disproportionate impact of certain laws and law enforcement practices on minority communities.
Well, it makes common sense when you think about it. Why would slave owners want their slaves in prison? Can't use them there.
That is a valid point. During the time of slavery, the main goal of slave owners was to keep their slaves working and productive, rather than locking them up in prison. The higher incarceration rates among black Americans today is the result of a complex array of factors, including historical injustice such as slavery and segregation, economic inequality, and systemic racism within the criminal justice system. It is important to acknowledge and address these factors in order to work towards a more equitable society.